recording? Yep. And as I told you, he was at the university in Oslo, Passwordbased in December 2012. And what fascinated me, I mean, he did he told us a little bit of the concept about this in a live evening talk in Oslo. And I was fascinated because it seemed like a crazy idea, but at the same time, there were really good people in the audience sitting there thinking like, how the hell are we supposed to be able to attack this? And with that, Jim.
Thanks, Barry. One of my big draws for me coming to Password 12 and now 15 is the people in the room are the people who are probably best apt to evaluate what I'm talking about and give me feedback. And BSides is definitely promoting, trying to make this more of a discussion. And so as we go through the slides, feel free to ask questions as we go and pipe up and tell me what you think. Or if I didn't explain something right, I'll go back. And I really want to communicate sort of how this works, give you a really intuition about why it should work, and then at the end we can have a little bit of discussion if we think this might actually change the environment at all, the threat environment for passwords. How many, just to get a feel for the room, how many people have heard of blind hashing before or know anything about it? So a few people, but a lot of new inductees, so that's good. One thing which is blatantly clear is how hostile this environment is and has become and continues to evolve into. I love this quote from James Comey of two kinds of companies in the U.S. Those who have been hacked, actually by the Chinese. This is the original quote, but those who have been hacked and those who just don't know they've been hacked. And really, we look at a timeline of the big hacks, and it's like it's a who's who. It's almost like if you haven't been hacked, you're not there yet. And this only goes to 2014. So the environment that we're in is almost like being hacked is the expectation. And so the assumptions around how to protect the password file and what happens when that file leaks and what should users do about it and what do we try to push users into doing to deal with that reality has really sort of taken over the conversation around passwords. But even the color, I think it's just year. It says, bubble color is year, and then the radius is the size of the attack. The other option was method of leak. But this is world's biggest data breaches. If you Google that, you'll get to the link. It's really neat visualization. I think that, despite how rampant password theft is, I still have this, I'm still incredibly infatuated with passwords. I think that as a way to authenticate, as a way to encrypt, as a way to secure, in the environment that we're in, where pretty much all of our data is being sucked up by third parties and commercialized and used against us in many different ways, passwords are the one thing that you can keep in your head, you can share it with the breath. They really have these unique advantages, and if we can make passwords secure, there's all these really amazing benefits to society, I think, that can come out of having the ability to have a secure password that can't be cracked, particularly for authentication and encryption. And so this is why I've spent the last few years trying to work on this idea of how can we really change the model of securing a password. The cost to companies at this point has become tremendous. If you're a CISO, your job is on the line when that breach occurs, or even the CEO at this point. We've seen fired, like in the Target breach. The actual fall when these breaches happen, they have a really material impact on companies, and the people that I've talked to over the last couple of years, they are very afraid of breaches. And that fear is driving investment, and that fear is driving like a willingness to try new things. And so there's definitely an opportunity out there, if there are new technologies, new approaches, to bring those to market. I think there's definitely a recognition that the industry best practices don't really protect users in the way that we want them to. If you look at attack vectors, we oftentimes separate out into online and offline. There's sort of a thing in the middle here with, interception, because of course the first thing we do with passwords is we send them in clear text from our browser to the server and hopefully through a protected channel. And so we're relying entirely on TLS, but there's so much that relies on that TLS that you can sort of take that out of the discussion for a minute, because if TLS falls, it's not just your password that you're worried about, it's really the world's on fire. So if you take out the interception, we have online attacks and offline attacks. And there's a paper that Microsoft Research put out, and I think Cormac talked about it earlier yesterday, about there's a huge dichotomy here between the type of attack that can happen online and the type of attack that can happen offline, and that they call that the online-offline chasm. And there's a little bit of an eye chart, but if we're looking at on the y-axis the risk of a password being guessed, and the blue line is an online attack and the orange line is an offline attack. On the x-axis, it's log 10 guesses, guessability of the password, right? And that's also a big topic. And so the whole driving force is we push users to move their password to the right on that curve. But what are we actually achieving when we do that? So in an online attack, if you've taken even basic precautions, and we've seen very noteworthy news, where, like for example, Apple had an API that wasn't rate limited, and people were able to exploit that to great effect. But if you can do some basic things on the server that are under your control, you can limit the online attack, the ability for an attacker to try to guess a password through your actual login interface, right? To a fairly small number of attempts. But in the offline sense, once that hash is out of your control, or if it's password-based encryption, once that ciphertext is in the wild, there's nothing stopping somebody except for their time and money and the ability to run that hash function to try to crack that file. And so there's, reasonable people can disagree about how far apart those curves are, but you're looking at 6, 8, 10, maybe 12 orders of magnitude in the guessability, complexity requirements of a password to survive an offline attack versus an online attack. And so what really comes out of this is anytime the password database is lost, regardless of what kind of hashing is used, you just assume that all the passwords have been stolen. And this puts companies in a terrible position because fundamentally the perimeter is permeable. You cannot build a perfect perimeter that you can beat some of the people some of the time. You can't beat all the attackers all of the time. 0 days happen. Exploits happen. And so the question is, how can we make it more resilient? How can we widen the attack window, add a better opportunity to defend when those windows open up? So, the limit of iterative hashing, and iterative hashing could be, PBKDF2, scrypt, bcrypt, or even, whatever that hashing is doing, whether it's, ultimately we're trying to take the CPU and the I/O and the compute resources at your disposal and use them to the maximum capability so that ideally the attacker has to work approximately as hard as you worked to run the same hash. An ideal hashing function doesn't give the attacker an advantage by switching, for example, over to an ASIC or an FPGA or a GPU. They can't move to a different architecture and beat you out on a dollars per hash or a joules per hash basis, right? So, assuming we have this ideal hash, ultimately, what's the real limiting factor? Well, how long is the user going to wait to get that login to happen? We have this hard limit, and Google might measure it in milliseconds, where between hitting enter on the login form and when you need to get that response back and start loading the next page. And so, any time we're trying to protect something in a runtime, I call it runtime, which is, while the user's logging in, you have this thing where you have this competing forces. Security increases with latency, but latency must be small. And so it puts an upper limit on how much cost can you put into the equation while the user's sitting there waiting. And you have this arms race where ultimately, over time, Moore's Law will happen and these hashes are easier and easier to crack. And so we're left with the only option left is we push the complexity of the end user, because ultimately, it's the multiplication. It's how hard was it to do one hash multiplied by the guessability of the password. So if we can move the guessability over, then maybe we'll give ourselves enough time to at least reset the password before the passwords get cracked. And so now we see this huge push for complex password policies, unique passwords on every site. All of this comes out of the fact that we can't protect the password at rest. And ultimately the company's in this position where they have to just assume all is lost if that file's lost. So let's just talk about the goals of a different kind of hashing function. What would be a different way, a complementary way? And the idea here is something that works on top of what we're already doing. We're not trying to replace hashing, iterative hashing. We're trying to augment it with something which is achieving a different kind of cost factor. So we want to decouple it, ideally, from the entropy of the password. So right now, with runtime, iterative hashing, it's very much entangled with the cost of the attacker depends entirely on how complex the password is, multiplied by how much work you did in that very limited runtime window. So to securely store weak passwords, we need to get something where we can add cost independent of runtime. Ideally, we'd love to be able to say that an online attack is impossible, even if that database is popped. even if there was a SQL injection or whatever, that lets people get access to the salts and hashes. And not like just impossible if your password's 22 characters, but I know that no passwords are going to be cracked, even though this breach happened. We'd like to be able to prevent somebody from saying, well, I'm not going to steal your whole database, I just want this 64 bytes right here, and then I'm going to go attack, Donald Trump and steal his money or whatever, right? Because I just have to crack his password, which is probably pretty simple, or whatever, right? So you don't want them to be able to go in and bypass the cost that, you're putting all this cost into every user's hash every time they log in, and yet they can go to the weakest link and empty that person's account. One absolute requirement is you can't, there was a trend a few years ago where people sort of equated password hashing with crypto, and they said, oh, don't roll your own crypto, well, don't roll your own password authentication, leave it to the experts, hand it over to Facebook or Google. And we've seen a big pushback against that, and I think very rightly so, because when you hand over essentially the keys to your castle, you're handing over some very, very valuable user data. You're sort of subjecting the user to a privacy breach, but you're also handing over you never want to be in a position where you say, oh, is this user authenticated? And some third party says, yes, they are. You're like, well, how prove it? You don't want to trust somebody else to say, this person should be let in. Was that the administrator? Oh yeah, it was the administrator. Let them in. No, that's not okay. So if you're going to use a third party, it has to be, in a sense, an untrusted third party to the degree that they can't make an invalid login look it out. Obviously, this has to be simple. And, we've had years of work just to get people to do hashing and salting, and it's still an ongoing uphill battle. And so anything new or on top of this is going to, be an incredibly difficult sell. On the flip side of that, what's really interesting is in the last year, we've seen data privacy become a competitive differentiator for companies. So companies are willing to take the extra step, invest the money to get that if they can see that it's real. If they can see that the technology provides like a real benefit, they'll invest the money into it and they'll say, okay, this is a competitive advantage for us to protect our users. So the willingness for people to adopt is there. And I think that, from a performance standpoint, no one's going to be willing to budge that window of, Google wants that response in 20 milliseconds or whatever. There's a very limited budget to work within from a time perspective, latency wise. And I think, to cap it all off, the end user experience is so important. I mean, the history of sort of password security is all about blaming the user. And I would like to have a technology where you can blame the service provider entirely and completely and say, if you lost that password, it's never the user's fault. It's because the service provider didn't do what they were supposed to do. If you can put the onus on them entirely and give them a tool that lets them protect those passwords regardless of how weak or complex they are, from offline attacks specifically, then how does that change the world we live in? The side benefit is if you have a way to protect weaker passwords, you can spend a lot less money trying to get people to pick these complex passwords. Your support desk costs go down dramatically because you don't have passwords that people can't remember. The usability of passwords overall goes up. I mean, there's this huge positive feedback loop if weaker passwords can actually be secure against offline attack. And of course, you have to respect the end user privacy. If they're logging into Site A is the only person who should see their personal information. So let's get to the point. What is the blind hashing data pool? Literally, what we're looking at here is kind of a brute force way to add cost into the system. And so we're going to do everything else the same as we would up until we get to the middle of this diagram. So user submits credentials to the server. This is just a standard web form, standard username and password coming over a TLS channel, gets to the server. The server's going to run the same hashing functions they would ordinarily. Scrypt, bcrypt, choose whatever hashing function you want. The key is that it has to be a salted hash, and the salt should be cryptographically secure random. Once you produce that hash, and I'll show a protocol diagram in a minute, which really steps through it, but once you produce that hash, you're going to send it to what I call the blind hashing data pool. And what the data pool will do is it'll use the hash as an index into a massive pool of completely random data. So literally, this grid you see in the middle, imagine terabytes or potentially petabytes of random generated data. The data never changes. The password isn't being stored in this block. The block is static. It can grow over time, but it's maybe an append only. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the key is, imagine, you take a cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generator and you fill terabytes of solid-state drives with random data. the hash points, basically, you use the hash as a way to decide which locations in the block to read from, and you collect those, and at the bottom, you hash that and you return it back. And the server can use that response. So it's 64, you can imagine, say, for example, 64 bytes in, 64 bytes out. That's what's actually happening at 30,000 feet. That response can be used as a second salt to another round of hashing, and then you save the value. So to look at pseudocode, username and password, the site has a users table, which has a salt 1 and a hash 2. Okay, and these values are not, you can't get from point A to point B like you normally would if it was a salt and a hash. When you do the first hashing function, you get an H1, you send that over in a function I'm calling getSalt to the data pool. The data pool uses it as a way to decide which locations in the file to read from, collects it at the bottom, hashes that, sends it back to you. There's an ID, if you can see it, which would uniquely identify either the site, the app, or the user, depending on the use case. And what that lets you do is, that's just a token, another 64-byte random. That lets you do things like say, well, for this ID, I'm going to have a private key. That's the KID on the right side. Point. For this ID, I'm going to have a private key that basically keys the data pool for that site. So even though I only have one set of solid-state drives with terabytes of data in it, when a certain site is using it to do a blind hash, that data looks unique to them. If we throw away that key, that process can never be completed again, because that data is you can no longer get the salt 2 from the hash 1 if we throw away that key. So this gives you a means for revocability. I'll talk about that in a second if I have time. So one of the key aspects here is, what does this actually mean to an attacker? So if we have this array of data and we get a lot of sites to come together and contribute to maintaining a very large array of data, we want to make sure that the attacker has to steal virtually all of it in order to crack even a single password, right? If they can steal a little bit of the data and crack a little bit of the passwords, we're right back to where we started, which is, I can do targeted attacks. But it turns out if you do these, every iteration that you use the hash to generate an index to look into the data pool, every time you iterate it, and you're going to be looking at a uniformly distributed random location in the data pool. And so each one of those lookups is going to, if there's data missing that the hacker wasn't able to steal, the likelihood that you're going to point to a location that they don't have increases. And so you can imagine if they have 50% of the data pool and you make one lookup, well, there's a 50-50 chance, right, that they're going to have the data. If you make two lookups, well, now you have to flip the coin twice, and now it's a 25% chance. So it's an exponentially decreasing attacker advantage, is the way, technically describe it. And you just by sort of eyeballing it, you can say, well, somewhere in the range of 32 or 64 lookups, we get into this location where the attacker now has to steal virtually all of the data pool before they can crack even 1 in a million or 1 in 100 million passwords, because they won't have the data to complete the function. And so now we've changed the cost factor, right? So now we live in a world where I can invest an arbitrary amount of money, right? I can take $10 million, I can take $100 million, and build a data pool that the attacker has to own all of, virtually all of, in order to crack a single password, even if the password's password. And that is a very different environment, because now if we can get sites to band together and build this thing, there's a huge network effect, right? Instead of every site spending $1,000 trying to protect their password, a million sites can spend, we can collectively spend some number of millions of dollars, build this service, and I think make offline attack is, basically a history. There's a couple details to add additional functionality. So one of the things is, who would ever adopt this service if it meant that if the service went away that they wouldn't be able to authenticate their users? That's the first objection I would hear going into a company. I can't risk adopting this because I don't know you're going to be around forever, and I don't want to reset all my users' passwords because the data pool gets corrupted. So you can basically escrow your hash one. Keep a copy of your H1 encrypted with a public key that's online. It's important. We heard about RSA padding a couple talks ago in Greg's talk, but it's important that it's not a deterministic encryption, right? You don't want it to just essentially be key stretching. So you do like an RSA padded, random padded RSA, and you can keep the hash one around. You keep the public key offline, like on a piece of paper in a vault somewhere. And if you ever need to get your H1s back, you bring that private key online. You can recover your H1s. And so this enables both the ability to peel back the blind hash, which gives you sort of, lock-in protection, because who wants to get locked into the service? But also, it's the ability, once you can recover H1, you can now upgrade your hash and reapply it. And so you can build a system between the public key that the site stores online and the private keys the data pool keeps. You can build this lockstep system where if either side gets breached, you can recover from the breach, recycle the key, and it's like it never happened. So you can actually get back, you can rewind the clock, you can get back to a state where without even resetting your user's passwords, that the passwords are safe again. Some of the interesting questions that come up is, for example, this data pool, which we built a 16 terabyte data pool that's actually running, and you can use the API and actually run this hashing function. We've got a bunch of sites that are running it live in production today. But obviously, a certain size is not going to be good for forever. And, every 3 to 5 years you're going to be doubling or maybe quadrupling the size of the data pool. So you need a way to grow it over time. There's a couple of different, two different ways that sort of come off the top of your head. One is you could just add to the end of it, generate new random data, stick it on the end, and then you just need to know when the hash was calculated, how big was the data pool then, and then how big is it now, and you can easily get back to the hash that you wanted. The other idea is maybe regenerating the pool and having like generations of blocks, but that would require people to skip ahead, so that it requires more interaction with the site, or else they might conceivably be left behind with hashes that are pointing to a data pool that doesn't exist anymore. And one last thing I want to talk about is, we've heard a lot about using passwords for encryption, and there was a great talk last year Jeff gave about. He talked about the Cablegate, the WikiLeaks Cablegate. It was an awesome story. In 5 seconds, basically, the idea was they put the ciphertext on BitTorrent in like 2010 or something, and in 2011 a book came out that had the password for it. And there was this big effort to sanitize the cables and not leak, sensitive information. But in the end, it was useless because once the password leaked, people who had the ciphertext, they were able to decrypt it. And so there's this notion that once the ciphertext is out there, it's gone forever, and that password is now at risk, right? And the other interesting thing is, I covered them up in case people want to guess, because it's kind of a fun game. So GNU-PG, if you're using password-based encryption, you're using GNU-PG with the defaults of the command line. What do you think the KDF is? How many rounds and what hashing function? Does anybody know? Jeff knows.
I know, but if you want people to guess.
If you want to guess, how many rounds? Let's say it's PBKDF2. How many rounds of iterations of? So GNU-PG by default is 2 to the 16th iterations of SHA-1. Okay, so this is like stage raising hands, and maybe they've changed this since I googled it. And then 1 iteration of SHA-1? Oh, okay. So it's, this is like easy to crack type of realm, right? Let's just do a couple more really quick, because so SSH keygen, right? SSH keygen. This is the keys to your kingdom. Gets you into the server, right? Up until 2013, end of 2013, what was the KDF? 1 round MD5. We have a winner. 1 iteration of MD5 to protect your SSH key. Up until through the end of 2013. And even now, the default, they changed it, but only for if you're using elliptical curve. How about? Yeah, I can't. The number is blanking, but it's how about TrueCrypt, which is now it's VeraCrypt, and they improved it in VeraCrypt. But what was TrueCrypt? The gold standard of keeping of an encrypted file system. And if anyone did cracking what you can, they would know, right? How many iterations of a KDF was it using to try to protect your password? 2,000 iterations of MD160, and there was a user interface choice, and one of them would only give you 1,000 iterations. Yeah, eCryptFS is something Ubuntu uses for encrypted partitions. 65. This one's not too terrible. 2 to the 16 of at least a SHA-512. So, the moral of the story is, when you encrypt with even the best practice tool, you have to be extremely careful of, what's happening with my password to turn it into a key? And how crackable is this? How much entropy do I need in the password? And obviously, once the ciphertext is out there, like we heard from Greg, it has everything you need to crack it. So you can use blind hashing as a KDF. If you run your KDF, if you add a blind hashing step into the process of deriving the key, you've now turned it into an online process. So now, decryption of, say, my hard drive although it will require an internet connection, is revocable. I can go to the blind hashing service and say, destroy the private key that corresponds to that app ID. Or I can say, when you try to decrypt my password, when you try to complete the KDS step to generate my key to decrypt my laptop, send me a text message and give me a two-factor authentication. So you can start doing all these really interesting things with encryption that's still fully within the control of the end user. And so there's a whole mostly unexplored territory of like an online KDS, a network KDS that give the user more control. So I just want to advance. There we go. So going back to that original diagram, imagine what a world would look like without offline attacks.
That would be boring.
If we can truly add a cost level that puts an offline attack out of the reach of the criminal elements that are using it to ultimately make money, right? That's the reason people do it. They do it to make money off the password. If it costs more to crack the password than you can make, well, a lot of people do it for pain. But you can eliminate the financial motive, and potentially eliminate even the feasibility of it if you can get your head around how big of a data pool that might take. What does the world look like where we only have to worry about online attack guessing? That's an interesting world. So that's blind hashing. I'd love to hear your question.
Where do you store this 16 terabyte of data, and how do you plan to access it, and how do you scale it?
It's a great question. So
at home, is it?
Yeah. So we're right now we have a data center in San Jose, it's co-located equipment, and a data center in Dallas, and we have 2 copies of the data. And of course, you can't just have 16 1 terabyte drives. You need redundancy within a rack. You need redundancy across racks. There's a lot of considerations as far as, you need to securely generate the data. You need to make sure that you can verify the integrity of the data. You want to know at the application layer that the data has, that some sort of bit error didn't occur, because obviously the blind hashing service would have no idea if the random data changed. So you need checksums that go all the way up to the application level. But the really interesting property is the bigger you make the data pool, the more solid-state drives you add, the more IOs per second the system can sustain. And so you get this, whereas in the previous world, security sort of increases as performance decreases, now we have a situation where security increases and performance increase in concert. So it's a really interesting environment. So like a 16 terabyte 24 disk array can usually do 100,000 blind hashes per second at 5 milliseconds per blind hash with 64 lookups for each blind hash. So you multiply it out. These drives, this technology wouldn't really be possible with spinning Rust, but with solid state, it just really it opened up the possibility to use not I/O but actual disk, actual bits as a cost factor. Very cool.
Quick one, last one.
So I feel like there's maybe something I'm not getting here, but aside from the size and the cost of these terabyte arrays, it kind of has this feel sort of like you're using them like a one-time pad, except they're not using them one time. And so to me, it just seems like you take something like an HSM and use it to generate the to use the you take the raw salt, process it through an HSM, and come up with a secret salt that you use. Is that
It effectively is an HSM. It acts the same, and the question is, what's your trust level in that hardware, and what's your confidence that it can't be stolen? So I think that using data adds a dimension of, like for example, RSA, Secure ID, was an and they lost the key, and all those devices were effectively compromised. And so, there's something about having a heft of petabytes of data, I think, that changed the equation of, this isn't going to be attacked over the network. If it takes, for example, 64 bytes in, 64 bytes out to do one blind hash, you can look at the network and you can say, well, if I want to support 10,000 blind hashes a second, it only works out to X number of bytes per second that I would ever expect to see over the line. If I divide that by the size of the data pool, you say, oh well, at full line rate, it's going to take them 800 days to download this file of the network. It just changes the attack window. So if there's a vulnerability in HSM, somebody could come in, steal the key, and go, right? If there's a vulnerability, and there will be, to the data pool, they can maybe start siphoning it out, but the simple heft of the data, will give you time to react. And if they can't get all the data, they've achieved nothing. Thanks very much, guys.
Cormac, is that you? Come on. Jeremy really wants to talk to you.
I was quoting your slide. I don't know if you saw it, but I stole some of your graphics.